Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to talk about name and form. A lot of us get very distracted by name and form. We tend to fixate on name and form, almost forgetting what it is that we're looking at or what is really there. In the Indian philosophy, where they talk about a wooden carved elephant. If I had a wooden carved elephant and I showed it to you, or most people, and say, "What do you see?" Most people would say it's an elephant. Very few would say it's a piece of wood carved in the shape of an elephant, which is actually much more accurate. When you say, "What do you see?" they fixate on the shape and form and say it's an elephant without really paying much mind to the wood or even the type of wood or anything else. They're stuck on the form as opposed to what is really there. And that's kind of the nature of what kind of substantiates the illusion of separation is this name and form. We fixate on the names and forms. And because there are many names and many forms that appear to be separate, we get caught up in this idea of multiplicity that exists in its own right, as if two things exist separately. Now, in defining the terms, name is pretty obvious. It's whatever name or label we give things. And it's a curious function of the brain that when we see something and label it, we almost stop seeing or looking at that point. If I pointed at a tree and I said, "What is that?" A lot of people would say, "It's a tree." Once they labeled it in their head and they recognize it as a tree and say, "Hey, that's a tree," they stop looking. They don't bother seeing what kind of tree it is, what makes that tree unique, why would it be pointed out. A lot of people superficially see and label. And once that superficial seeing and labeling happens, they quit looking any deeper. And so that is the danger of name and labeling things, is we get really stuck on the terms and the names. I mean, even in language, people get very stuck on what words we use. And so often a lot of the arguments are more about the terms rather than the meaning. So it is something to watch out for. And it is possible to play with, or in an exercise, stop labeling and just see things and trying to catch yourself before you label something, or even if you label something, toss it away, so to speak, and go, "It's not that," and look again. And it's an interesting exercise to try to get sometimes past that auto-labeling, auto-naming feature of the brain. Now, form, of course, defined is form, whatever shape things take. And we become very fixated on shapes of things. And as soon as we recognize a shape or a pattern, we think it's its own entity in its own sake. For example, if you go to a river and you see a whirlpool, and then the next week you go to the same river and roughly the same location, you see a whirlpool, you think it's the same whirlpool. But there's nothing there that is the same, that is the same from the prior time you saw it. None of the water is the same. The water is constantly flowing. And then, furthermore, because of the consistent pattern, we give it its own entity in our mind. We say it's a whirlpool in the river, as if the whirlpool is separate than the river. It's not a whirlpool in a river. They're not separate things. It's just a river. But due to the way the bottom of the river is, there happens to be a pattern of a swirling of water in this area. And yeah, you can call it a whirlpool. But when we, like I said, when we see the pattern and shape, we fixate and want to make it separate from everything else. It's just an interesting feature of the way our brains work. Now, through this, we often forget what we're really looking at, as I said, because if there was a gold ring, a gold fork, a gold plate, a gold bowl, a gold necklace, most people would see all these things, and due to their utility, we would call them different things. But if they're all gold, what is really there is just gold. The temporary shape doesn't even particularly matter. It's gold. You know, if we fixate, if we focus on the form becomes more important than the substance. And that's the issue I'm trying to point out, is the substance is, if not as important, if not more important than the form. Take when we are dreaming at night. When we dream, we usually have the perspective of a single dream character. And it has its own memories, thoughts, things like that. And during the course of the dream, you're doing things, and you see other people, and other people seem to have their own points of view and have their own memories and such. There's, trees, there's rocks, all manner of different things. But nothing in the dream is truly other than you. There is no one else in your dream. All of a dream is you, arising from a single consciousness. And so if you're dreaming that you're being chased by somebody, you're really chasing yourself. There's no one else there. And so if you fixate on the forms, you would say each dream character is separate, forgetting that it really is all one thing. It's all you. The substance of everything in the dream is you. There's nothing in the dream that's other than you. But we give so much weight to the form. And to recognize, to realize the self, that which is everything, to a large extent is letting go, or no longer fixating, no longer being attached to name and form. Name and form is not all that important. Name and form is temporary. Name in particular even varies depending on which region or culture you're in. Form, a lot of times, is based on utility, the use to us. And so a piece of cloth could be the same piece, just a square piece of cloth. Could be used as a tablecloth. Could be a cloak, if held or tied around the neck. Could be any number of things, a bed sheet, whatever. But those functions, the utility, along with the form pattern, creates this idea of separate things. It's one thing, though. A square piece of cloth is a square piece of cloth, regardless of its use, regardless of its functionality. Form is also, like I said, temporary. All forms come and go. But the substance, that which, I know in a lot of teachings they'll say what lies behind, or, but I'll get into that in a second. But basically the substance remains the same. What is always the case. If you saw everything is energy, regardless of form, because form is just another version of energy. If everything's energy, what does the form matter so much? Regardless of form change, the energy's still there. Energy's still the same. But I caution a little bit in that when you're trying to point, it is somewhat easy, I guess, to say what lies behind, because in Indian philosophy they'll talk about the substratum, that or ultimate reality, and it is useful to point so, but there is a bit of a trap, because if you say ultimate reality, you make it sound like it's something other than reality that we experience. It's ultimate reality. It's something beyond. If you say substratum, you make it sound like it's something underneath or hidden behind everything. And that's not the case. It's not beyond. It's not hidden. It was all one to begin with. It's our fixation on name and form that lends the idea of multiplicity. So, for example, although a lot of this is melting, I've got a couple ice cubes that are still left in this glass of water. But it can be rightly said that the only thing in this glass is water. Yes, there are a few ice cubes, but what is an ice cube other than water? And so some people, if they were shown this glass, especially if the ice cubes were a little bit bigger, and they were asked, what do you see? A lot of people might say, I see some ice cubes and a glass of water. Well, that's being very fixated on form, and then naming the ice cubes as separate than the water. It's just a glass of water. Some of the water is solid in the form of ice. Some of the water is liquid, and they call it water. It's just water. When the ice cubes fully melt away and there's none left, it's still just a glass of water. No more, no less than prior. It doesn't matter whether the form's there or not. It's just a glass of water. And so, if we fixate on the form, well, these are different ice cubes. This one's got different cracks. This one's bigger. This one's smaller. This one seems to be melting or in worse shape than other ice cubes. We can form all these characteristics based on the individual forms of each ice cube. We almost trick ourselves into thinking there's so many different things here. There's different things. There's so much here. There isn't. It's just a glass of water. And so that's what it's like with the self. There's just the self. There's nothing else. Only if you fixate on the forms do the forms really matter. If you fixate on name and form, the continuation of a specific form matters. It's kind of like if you were fixated and attached to the existence of the ice cube in the glass of water, and slowly melting away. It's now this ordeal and the story. It's going away. But what's happening? It's just solid turning into liquid. It's water before and after. Nothing's happening. It's just a change of form. And the change of form does not harm or matter to water. It only matters to the form if you fixate and attach to the form. Now, last thing I want to say, which I got a little distracted on, was forms come and go. They arise and go away. The beginning and ends of forms, what we call the beginning and end, is rather arbitrary. Because if you say, well, what was the beginning of this body? Or if people, as normal people identify as of a me, what's the beginning of me? And some people will say, well, it's when the body is born. When it's born and the birth certificate signed, you were born. Others define the beginning of that life differently. Others would say, well, it's when the first breath is taken. Others might say, well, it's after so many weeks of growth in the womb when it's able to be sustained alone. Others might say it began when the egg was fertilized, when conception happened. But even that's arbitrary, because you could even say it was when your parents met and there was that ugly gleam in their eyes as they embraced each other. That could have been the beginning. The end. When is the end? I mean, these are fairly arbitrary if you really look at it closely. And all these arguments of when life begins, the reason the argument is even there is because it's arbitrary. People can place all these different values on when it begins because it's arbitrary. However, that's assuming there's a such thing as a noun, that there's a such thing as a thing, basically. Because if you look everywhere in the world, in nature, there are no nouns. There's really only verbs. It's a convention of speech that we have a noun and a verb. So we have a noun and it's doing something, and that's conveyed by the verb. But really, there's just verbs. There is nothing that's static. It's ever changing. For example, let's say, I went to school at St. Cloud State University. Well, what is St. Cloud State University? The students swap out every so many years as they graduate. The faculty swap out at a slower rate. Buildings come and go. I mean, in the course of so many years, there might be not a person or a building left. That's the same. And yet it's still called St. Cloud State University, or any location. Everything could change, and yet the label and the idea of it being a static form in some way remains the same. But really, it's constant change activity. It's process. My point is, everything is process in terms of it's a verb. And then mostly a lot of things are cycles. If you look at the water cycle in nature, with rain coming down on the ground, forming puddles, streams, rivers, going to the ocean, evaporation, forming clouds, then raining. It's just a continuous cycle. Now we've got separate names and forms for each thing. Although those are those are clouds, that's rain, that's puddles, that's rivers, that's streams, that's ocean. However, if really any part of the process was removed, the cycle would collapse. There's no beginning or end. In any circle, there's no beginning or end in a circle. And so, what is the beginning of a river? Well, is it, the first puddles in the highest elevations? Is it the rain? I mean, the entire cycle is there and needs to be there for each part to exist. And so, if you fixate on the forms, you can create all these different individual forms and ideas. along each step of a process, the cycle. But for the cycle to continue, everything's got to be there. So none of it's separate. None of it could be excluded and keep the cycle going. And so really, nothing within the circle is really other or separate. The whole cycle in total is the entity, the system, the process. And all of everything is like that. Everything is one system, one, it's the self could be called one system. There's nothing other or outside of it. And because of that, everything is, you could call it interconnection, interdependence, interconnectivity. These kind of terms pop up, but it's deeper than that. It's that the name and form doesn't really matter. In a glass of ice cubes, in a glass of water with ice cubes, all there is water. And a bunch of gold ornaments and items, it's just gold. In a wood-carved elephant, it's wood. Instead of the name and form getting fixated on the appearance, the trick is to pay attention and notice what's actually there. Because name and form is in the mind, really. Because of the patterns and our arbitrary segmenting of beginnings and ends and entities, and we create the forms. The forms aren't separate. They're one thing, but we create individual forms in the mind. I'd once, like I said, spoke about the Pando, a forest in Utah. And you could ask somebody, well, how many trees do you see? And they would say hundreds, thousands of trees. That's only because they don't really see. They don't understand that it's one tree. It's one organism. Because of, the massive, it's almost like, it's kind of a root system, but it's like if there was a tree laying outside and branches were sticking up. It's individual clones of these aspen trees. But it's really all one connected organism. It's actually listed as one of the biggest organisms on the planet because of that. But if we're fixated on name and form in particular, we would be fixated on the individual trees. Individual trees, again, being sucked in by name and form. There's no individual trees. It's one tree. But as we look at this, we'd see, well, some are tall, some are short. Some might have fire damage, some might not. Some might have disease, bugs. Some might have been, maybe a couple have been struck by lightning. And you could see all these individual differences to give the appearance of individual trees. But there's only ever been one tree. It's because they don't see that which makes them all one. It's being stuck on name and form. Being stuck on the form of the idea of individual forms. That's what obscures the self. That's what obscures non-duality. Is the fixation, the attachment to name and form in particular. We're really particular about form. I'm not suggesting there's a way to see things where forms are not that big of a deal, regardless of the state, the timing, the condition of the ice cubes in a glass of water. It's all water. It's all water. Regardless, nothing gained or lost. Even if all the ice cubes had melted in the water, nothing was gained or lost. There's no gain or loss. The exact same amount of water would still be in that glass. What was gained or lost is the idea of the form, an individual form. But in actuality, nothing was lost. So a little bit of a rambling today, I guess. But name and form, something to be aware of. It's a rather seductive trap that maintains this idea of multiplicity and duality. But if you have any questions, please post below. Would love it if you haven't already. I would love it if you subscribe to the channel, or share it with other people. But until next time, thank you much.